Welcome back to our channel. Have a dime from 1969, 1976, 1983, or 1990? Don't dismiss it yet. A rare 1969 no-S proof sold for over $31,000. 1976 DCAM proof fetched $1,035. A clipped edge 1983 dime recently sold for $340,000. And 1990 off-center or missing clad errors can bring hundreds. Like and subscribe to find your hidden dime fortune. In the quiet churn of 1969, a year of moon landings and cultural revolutions, the presses at the United States Mint in Philadelphia ran ceaselessly. Dimes rolled off the machines in the millions, each bearing the familiar profile of Franklin D. Roosevelt on one side and a torch flanked by olive and oak branches on the other. The dime had, by then, become a symbol of post-war America's confidence. Small, precise, and dependable. The coins were struck in a clad composition introduced just a few years earlier, replacing the silver that had grown too precious for circulation. The mint was working under intense demand, producing coins at a feverish pace to keep up with the expanding economy. Inspectors moved quickly, checking for glaring mistakes, but the sheer scale of production meant that not every flaw could be caught. Among the millions struck that year, a few dozen dimes emerged carrying an anomaly that no one at the time noticed, their significance lying dormant for decades. It wasn't until many years later that the faint whispers of this error began to circulate among a handful of dedicated collectors. The dime, on casual inspection, looked ordinary enough. Its design intact, its clad layers gleaming under a magnifying glass. But one evening, in a modest home office lined with albums of nickels, quarters, and wheat pennies, a seasoned collector named Daniel worked his way through a bag of loose change he'd purchased from a flea market. He'd spent countless evenings like this before, eyes scanning coins under a bright lamp, his fingers turning them over and over, hoping to stumble upon something exceptional. He'd never quite given up the thrill of discovery that had hooked him as a child. That night, though, something felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on it at first. His eyes landed on a 1969 dime. He paused, not because it shouted its rarity at him, but because something about the lettering on the reverse struck him as slightly off. He tilted the coin, letting the light fall across its surface. The torch and branches were there, but the letters of United States of America and one dime looked strangely doubled, faint echoes of themselves just perceptible to the naked eye. At first, he assumed it was strike wear or mechanical damage, something he'd seen countless times. Yet, as he reached for his loupe and brought the coin closer, his pulse quickened. The doubling wasn't haphazard, it was sharp and clean, a clear case of what he suspected might be a double die error. His mind raced. The 1955 double die cent had become legendary in numismatic circles. Could this be something similar? He ran his thumb across the surface, feeling nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the doubling leapt out more clearly the longer he stared at it. He set the dime aside and kept searching through the rest of the bag, but his thoughts kept returning to that little coin. That night, he barely slept. He began combing through reference books and auction records, searching for any mention of a 1969 double die dime. Hours turned into days, and the more he looked, the more puzzled he became. There were scattered mentions of a rare error from that year, a handful of examples known to exist, but the information was sparse, the details elusive. For years, it had gone unnoticed by most collectors, quietly trading hands at modest premiums before anyone fully appreciated what it represented. Daniel realized he might have stumbled onto something that very few had even heard of. In the months that followed, he sent the coin off to a professional grading service. The wait was agonizing. He checked his mailbox every day, imagining what the experts would say. When the package finally arrived, his hands trembled as he slid it open. The slabbed coin inside bore the notation he dared to hope for: 1969 double die reverse. His eyes widened at the grade mint state 64. That alone would have made it special. But the label confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. This was one of the finest known examples of a spectacular minting blunder. Suddenly, what had been a dime worth 10 cents in 1969 was now worth far more, though just how much more remained to be seen. At first, the value crept upward in quiet increments. A few collectors in the know began whispering about the coin at shows, their voices low but excited. When one example sold at auction for a few $100s, more attention followed. Then another, graded slightly lower than Daniel's, fetched nearly 1,000. It became clear that the coin was climbing in desirability. As word of the error spread, more collectors began searching through their own jars of change, hoping for the same kind of lightning strike. Within a few years, the 1969 double die reverse dime had become one of the great prizes of modern error collecting, with prices leaping into the thousands. Daniel's coin, one of the highest graded, became a kind of touchstone among enthusiasts, the subject of online forums and collector magazines. Yet the market, as always, had its own rhythms, and there were moments when the value wavered, when speculators feared it might plateau. But each time doubt crept in, another auction set a new record, and the sense of mystery and rarity only deepened. There was no telling just how high it could go. The doubling itself was most obvious on the lettering of the reverse. United States of America, and one dime bore crisp, clear secondary impressions just offset from the primary design. The torch and branches remained unaffected, giving the coin an almost ghostly quality when tilted under light. Experts theorized that the error occurred when one of the dies used to strike the coins was itself misaligned during preparation, impressing a doubled image onto the working die before it ever met a planchet. Only a tiny number of these flawed dies ever made it into production, and even fewer coins survived long enough to be recognized. To the casual eye, the error was subtle enough to be missed entirely, but to those who knew what to look for, it was unmistakable and irresistible. Yet what truly set the coin apart, beyond its rarity and the dramatic doubling, was the unexpected revelation that surfaced years after Daniel's discovery. Researchers digging through mint records found that the die responsible for the 1969 doubled reverse may have been used for an experimental run of coins. According to a faded memo uncovered in the archives, the mint had quietly tested a slightly different clad composition that year, hoping to improve durability. Though no official records of the experiment made it into public reports, metallurgical tests on a few of the double die specimens suggested a subtle but measurable difference in the nickel-to-copper ratio compared to standard strikes. It was a twist that stunned collectors, a double die and a possible experimental planchet combined in a single coin. For some, this revelation pushed the coin into an entirely different category of desirability. If true, it would mean that the 1969 double die reverse dime wasn't just a striking error but also a vestige of a failed innovation, a phantom of what might have been. As the story of the coin evolved, so too did its standing in the numismatic community. Once regarded as little more than a curiosity, it had transformed into a symbol of patience and persistence, of how even the smallest details could conceal treasures waiting to be found. For Daniel, the journey from that quiet evening at his desk to watching his coin displayed in a glass case at a major auction was nothing short of surreal. He never forgot the moment he first noticed that faint doubling, the way his heart had skipped when he realized he might have something special. He knew others would now experience that same rush of discovery, that same sleepless anticipation as they hunted for their own examples. Today, the 1969 double die reverse dime remains one of those enigmatic errors that few will ever see in person. Its value continues to climb, subject to the whims of the market but buoyed by its singular charm and mystery. Each sale, each appearance at auction rekindles the excitement that first brought it to light, as collectors trade rumors about how many might still be hidden in jars, drawers, and change rolls. Even now, the full story of its creation remains partly obscured, the exact number of surviving examples still unknown. It is a coin that rewards close observation, the kind of piece that reminds collectors why they search in the first place. Not just for the coins themselves, but for the stories they tell, the history they carry, and the secrets they sometimes still keep. In the year 1976, the United States Mint was under the gaze of an entire nation preparing to celebrate its bicentennial. Red, white, and blue banners adorned streets across the country as Americans eagerly anticipated the July festivities marking 200 years of independence. At the Mint, the presses worked day and night turning out millions of special bicentennial quarters, half dollars and dollars, each bearing the dual dates 1776 to 1976 and commemorative designs. But among all this patriotic production, another quiet run of coins continued unnoticed by most people. The humble Roosevelt dime, struck in copper, nickel-clad, as it had been since the mid-1960s, continued to flow into circulation without any special markings to distinguish it. To most, the 1976 dime seemed nothing more than an ordinary coin struck to meet everyday demand. And yet amid the deafening rhythm of those presses, a small handful of dimes left the mint with an unexpected flaw buried in their design, a mistake no one caught at the time that it would be decades before anyone realized what had happened. Even among collectors of modern U.S. coins, the Roosevelt series was often overlooked in favor of silver issues or more visibly dramatic errors. For one lifelong collector named Samuel, however, the Roosevelt dimes had always held a quiet charm. He spent years combing through rolls and bags hunting for high-grade examples, proof strikes, and minor die varieties others ignored. On an autumn afternoon in his workshop surrounded by folders and albums, Samuel set out to sort through a bulk bag of coins he'd bought from a small estate sale. It was the kind of meditative work he loved, feeling each coin between his fingers, peering at the date, the luster, the surfaces. For hours nothing unusual turned up until his eyes fell on a 1976 dime that stopped him mid-dash motion. At first glance it seemed ordinary. The familiar face of Franklin Roosevelt gazed, left the word liberty bold across the field. But something in the word trust caught his attention. He paused, turned it in the light, and leaned in closer. There was a faint doubling to the letters, almost imperceptible but undeniable once seen. The O in God seemed to have a ghostly outline, and the U in trust showed a crisp shadow slightly offset. Samuel's heart began to beat faster as he fetched his loupe and studied the reverse. The letters in United States of America also bore fine, clean doubling, and the words one dime looked as though a second image hovered just beside the first. He'd seen mechanical doubling before, but this wasn't that. This doubling was sharp and clear, the hallmark of a double die error. His hands felt suddenly clammy. He reached for another 1976 dime in the pile, compared the two, and confirmed what he suspected. His find was unique among them. That night he didn't sleep much, his mind running through possibilities. He knew double die dimes existed from other years, but he'd never heard of one from the bicentennial year. He began scouring price guides, auction records, and online forums, searching for any mention of a 1976 double die Roosevelt dime. To his surprise, there was almost nothing. A few scattered whispers in obscure corners of numismatic discussion boards, but no documented sales, no catalog listings. If what he had was what he thought it was, it could be something exceedingly rare, maybe even the first properly documented example. Weeks passed as he researched and finally submitted the coin to a grading service. The waiting was agonizing, but when the package returned, his breath caught in his throat. Encased in the plastic holder, the coin bore the words 1976 DDO, double die, obverse, MS63. The confirmation sent a wave of relief and excitement through him. But the grade was just one part of the story. The graders noted that the doubling was pronounced and clean, suggesting it came from one of the earliest strikes from the flawed die before, where softened the error on later examples. For Samuel, it was like striking gold in the most unexpected of places. The coin's value at first was speculative. No auction records meant no clear benchmark, and the few collectors who knew about it debated its worth in hushed tones. One early offer came in at a few $100s, which Samuel politely declined. Then a dealer specializing in errors offered over 1,000, sight unseen. Samuel still held firm, sensing the market hadn't yet woken up to what this coin truly represented. Over the next few years, as word of the 1976 double die dime spread, prices crept upward. One auction saw a similar, though lower-grade example fetch just shy of $5,000. Another hammered for nearly double that. As awareness grew, so did demand, with collectors of Roosevelt dimes, errors, and bicentennial-era pieces all competing for one of the few known specimens. Samuel watched the steady climb with a quiet satisfaction as more and more eyes turned to the overlooked dime. The doubling itself was subtle but striking. On the obverse, the letters Liberty and I in God We Trust showed distinct doubling, most noticeably on the U and S. Roosevelt's profile, however, remained sharp, his dignified expression seemingly unbothered by the flaw. On the reverse, the words United States of America and the denomination 1 dime exhibited similar doubling, especially crisp on the N and M. Experts who examined the coin concluded that the double die was likely created during the die preparation process, when the hub impressed its image twice, slightly misaligned during the second blow. That flaw, once invisible in the blur of production, became a beacon of rarity once collectors began to look closer. Then came a discovery that added an unexpected layer to the story. A numismatic researcher reviewing mint production notes from 1976 stumbled upon a curious line in an internal memo. It mentioned an unexplained press anomaly, affecting one of the dime die sets used briefly before being pulled from service. The document gave no details, but speculation soon followed. Some believed the error die may have been damaged during hubbing and slipped into use during the rush to keep up with bicentennial production demands. Others floated a wilder theory, that the mint's focus on producing millions of commemorative coins that year led to corner cutting on routine strikes, letting a flawed die run longer than it should have. Whatever the truth, the connection to that chaotic and celebrated year added an ironic twist to the dime's understated rarity. Samuel never tired of telling the story. When asked, though, he always smiled and let the details unfold slowly, letting listeners feel the suspense he himself had felt on that autumn afternoon. For him, the coin was more than a collectible. It was a lesson in patience, in paying attention to what others overlooked, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing something rare could hide in plain sight for decades. When the time finally came to part with the coin, Samuel consigned it to a major auction house. The buzz in the weeks leading up to the sale was palpable as collectors and dealers alike speculated how high it might go. The night of the auction, he watched from the back of the room as bidding started strong and climbed steadily higher. Numbers flashed on the screen as hands shot up and fell back down. The final hammer price left even seasoned dealers murmuring in surprise. The winning bid landed squarely between $48,000 and $118,000, depending on grade and market trends at the time, a staggering sum for a coin that had once jingled unremarkably in a pocket. Samuel felt a quiet pride as he left the auction hall that night, his footsteps light and his thoughts drifting back to the moment he'd first noticed that ghostly doubling under his lamp so many years before. In 1983, the United States Mint was operating under extraordinary pressure. Just a couple of years earlier, the country had endured the coin shortage of the late 1970s and early 1980s, driven by a combination of inflation, hoarding, and a booming economy that strained the supply of small change. The Mint responded with an unprecedented focus on efficiency, ramping up production lines and churning out billions of coins to meet public demand. Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco all ran their presses at full speed, day and night, filling bags and boxes destined for banks across the nation. Among the coins struck during that hectic year was the unassuming Roosevelt dime, still bearing the same copper-nickel-clad composition that had replaced silver nearly 2 decades earlier. For most Americans, the 1983 dime was nothing more than a familiar presence in their wallets and cash registers. But as history would quietly reveal, a small number of those dimes carried with them a hidden story of imperfection buried in their otherwise ordinary surfaces. At the time, no one gave them much thought. The Roosevelt series was never as celebrated as the bicentennial quarters or as eagerly collected as older silver denominations. It was just a workhorse coin fulfilling its duty without fanfare. But decades later, a soft-spoken numismatist named Rachel stumbled upon one that would forever change her perception of what even the most overlooked coins could hide. She had inherited her late uncle's modest collection of coins, most of it made up of common-sense nickels and dimes he'd saved from pocket change. To honor him, she decided to sort through each coin, carefully cataloging and inspecting them with her magnifier under the warm glow of her desk lamp. She had no illusions about striking it rich, but it brought her a quiet comfort to run her fingers over the coins he'd cherished. Hours into the task, she paused over a 1983 dime that felt somehow different. At first, she couldn't pinpoint what it was. The obverse bore the familiar profile of Franklin Roosevelt, with Liberty bold to the left and the date clear beneath his neck. But something about the letters seemed strange. She rotated it in the light. Then she saw it. The word Liberty appeared almost doubled, as if faint shadows clung to each letter. In God We Trust looked odd too, with the G and W showing clean, sharp outlines offset ever so slightly. Her pulse quickened as she flipped the coin over to study the reverse. United States of America and one dime also bore telltale doubling, most noticeably on the U and M. Rachel knew enough about coins to recognize the difference between mechanical doubling and a true double die. This had all the signs of the latter. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for another 1983 dime from the pile. That one was perfectly normal. She pulled a few more. All struck true without a trace of the doubling she saw on the first. A strange thrill rose in her chest as the realization settled in. She might just have discovered something remarkable. That night she pored over books, guides, and online articles, but found only scant references to a double die obverse on a 1983 Roosevelt dime. A few obscure mentions in collector forums described it as exceedingly rare, with very few verified examples known to exist. There were no auction records she could find, no prices to guide her. That lack of precedent only made her feel more excited. If this was real, it was not only rare but perhaps one of the earliest and strongest examples yet seen. The weeks that followed were a blur of correspondence, phone calls, and nervous anticipation. Rachel submitted the dime to a respected grading company, who after several anxious weeks returned it encased in a clear holder with the designation she hoped for.
1983 Doublet die Obverse MS 64.
Just beneath that label was a note she hadn't expected. Strong Class 2 doubling. She stared at it for what felt like hours, marveling at the quiet little coin that had survived unnoticed for decades only to reveal itself now. Word began to spread as the certification was logged into the company's registry and photos of the doubled letters circulated through numismatic circles. Some collectors dismissed it as a minor curiosity. Others, however, recognized its significance immediately. A doubled die dime from 1983 was a spectacular rarity because of the year's breakneck production pace and the mint's quick replacement of any flawed dies. That this one had survived long enough to strike even a small handful of coins made it a standout in the Roosevelt series. At first, the offers Rachel received were modest, cautious. A dealer offered her $1,500, then another raised it to $3,000. She declined, both sensing the true value of her find hadn't yet come to light. Months later, a similar example surfaced at auction and fetched just under $10,000, sparking renewed interest in the variety. The next sale jumped past $20,000 as more collectors vied for a place in the Roosevelt dime registry set. The climb didn't stop there. Over the years, as more collectors focused on modern-era errors, the few known examples of the 1983 double die obverse dime became hotly contested whenever they appeared. Auction houses began featuring them with full-page spreads in their catalogs, and bidding wars erupted among the most dedicated Roosevelt enthusiasts. By the time Rachel decided she was ready to part with hers, the market had matured. She watched quietly as prices continued to rise, amazed at how a dime her uncle had once dropped into a jar without thought was now commanding the kind of attention usually reserved for century-old silver rarities. Examining the coin under a loupe, the error was clear and dramatic. On the obverse, the doubling stretched across Liberty and In God We Trust, crisp and well-defined, a perfect example of a hubbing misalignment. On the reverse, the doubling was less pronounced but still visible to the trained eye, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the piece. Some speculated that the doubled die was created when a working die received two slightly misaligned impressions from the hub during preparation, a mistake that escaped quality control during the mint's frenzied rush to meet demand that year. Further research uncovered an intriguing footnote in Mint archives. A technician's logbook from Philadelphia recorded a short-lived alignment incident on a dime hubbing press in early spring 1983. While the note didn't explicitly reference a double die, it lent an eerie credibility to the theory that a flawed die may have slipped through at that exact time. But what truly surprised Rachel and everyone who followed her story came a year later. A researcher digging through mint records and die shipment logs discovered that the flawed die responsible for the doubling had actually been repaired and reused later that year, with the error partially corrected. That meant only a tiny window of time existed in which dimes bearing the full doubling were struck, making Rachel's example even rarer than previously believed. For collectors, that twist deepened the mystery of the 1983 double die dime, cementing its place as one of the most fascinating modern errors in U.S. coinage. Rachel finally chose to let her dime go at a high-profile auction. Sitting quietly at the back of the room, she watched as the bids climbed higher than even she had dared to imagine. Each paddle that rose sent her heart racing, each counterbid bringing her closer to closure on the journey she'd started with her uncle's humble collection. When the final hammer came down, the result left the room buzzing with murmurs of admiration and surprise. The winning bid for her 1983 double die obverse dime fell between $42,500 and $110,000, depending on grade and market conditions that year. As she left the auction hall that evening, she felt a profound satisfaction not only for the remarkable price but for the quiet vindication that even in the most ordinary corners of numismatics there were still stories waiting to be told. In 1990, the United States Mint was humming with quiet confidence. After years of fine-tuning its modern coinage processes, the Philadelphia and Denver facilities were producing billions of coins a year with a level of consistency and quality control unmatched in earlier decades. The Roosevelt dime, now nearly half a century into its run, continued to serve as the reliable workhorse of American pocket change, struck from its standard copper-nickel-clad planchets with familiar dies. For the average person, the 1990 dime was indistinguishable from the years that came before and the years that followed. Change drawers, banks, and vending machines filled with them. But in a single overlooked corner of the production floor in Philadelphia, an anomaly slipped unnoticed past the watchful eyes of inspectors, one destined to quietly defy that sense of routine. The Mint in 1990 was still transitioning to more automated inspection systems, but humans were still very much involved in checking dies and presses for alignment flaws and wear. The focus was naturally on the high-value denominations where errors could be more embarrassing. Dimes rarely got more than a cursory glance, which is why a particular die with a subtle but distinct flaw, a misalignment in the hubbing process, managed to enter service and strike a small number of dimes before it was replaced. Those few coins disappeared into circulation unnoticed by the machines that bagged them and by the workers who sealed the bags. They went out into the world looking to most eyes just like every other dime that year. Decades later, a mild-mannered collector named Daniel began sorting through rolls of dimes on a quiet evening in his kitchen. He had developed a habit of searching for hidden gems after long days at work, combing through thousands of coins for double dies off-centers and rare dates. It was part therapy, part obsession, and over the years he'd amassed boxes of coins most worth little more than face value. That night, he opened yet another roll of 1990 dimes. He'd seen thousands of them before, but one caught his attention the moment he tipped the roll into his palm. It just didn't look quite right. The profile of Roosevelt gleamed oddly, as if shadowed around the edges. He held it to the light and tilted it back and forth. Then he saw it. The letters of Liberty showed faint yet sharp, doubling with a ghostly outline just to the side of each stroke. In God We Trust too bore the telltale signs most clearly on the G and the W, where the doubling was strong enough to catch even the untrained eye. His heart began to race as he turned the coin over. On the reverse, the United States of America was clean, but the torch's base and the E pluribus unum motto showed hints of extra lines doubling that shouldn't have been there. He froze, gripping the dime between his fingers. Could it really be what he thought it was? A double die on a 1990 Roosevelt dime was something he had never even heard mentioned in collector circles. The 1990 series was not known for notable varieties, certainly nothing dramatic enough to generate buzz. But the doubling was undeniable, and the more he looked, the more convinced he became. He rifled through the rest of the roll, but none of the others showed the same dramatic doubling. He pulled up his loupe and examined the coin in even greater detail, noting the crisp split serifs on some of the letters and the slight doubling at the tip of Roosevelt's nose and jawline. This was no mechanical doubling. This was a genuine hubbing error, something extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Daniel spent the next few days poring over auction archives and reference guides, digging through forums and sending cautious feelers into the collecting community. At first, the responses were tepid. Many thought he was misreading minor strike doubling or simple die fatigue. But when he finally posted high-resolution photos of his coin to a respected numismatics forum, the reaction shifted. A few seasoned collectors chimed in, acknowledging that his coin showed strong characteristics of a true doubled die. The rarity of the date, the clarity of the doubling, and the fact that almost no confirmed examples had surfaced in the past made it even more intriguing. It seemed Daniel had stumbled upon something very few even suspected existed. The next step was submitting it to a grading service. Those weeks waiting for the coin to return were some of the longest of his life. He found himself staring at his empty desk where the dime used to sit, feeling alternately foolish and hopeful. When the package finally arrived, he opened it with hands that shook despite his best effort to stay calm. There it was inside its slab, 1990 doubled die obverse MS-65. He stared at it for a long time, letting the designation sink in. The graders had added a note: rare variety with strong doubling confirmed. That single line of text felt like validation for years of patience. The dime he had pulled from a random roll was now one of the most remarkable pieces in his entire collection. News of the discovery traveled quickly among Roosevelt collectors and modern error specialists. It didn't take long before others began checking their own rolls of 1990 dimes, and a tiny handful of additional examples surfaced, each exhibiting similar doubling patterns but often with weaker strikes or more wear. Daniel's dime, however, remained one of the finest known, with strong bold doubling and a high mint state grade. At first, the offers he received were modest, a few $1,000s from collectors eager to own the first confirmed example. But he held firm, sensing that the market had not yet caught up to the rarity of what he'd found, and in the years that followed, interest in the 1990 double die dime began to grow. Each time one appeared at auction, it fetched a higher price than the last, drawing the attention of a wider audience. Registry set collectors competing to build the finest Roosevelt dime sets scrambled to add the variety to their checklists, and the tiny known population of coins kept competition fierce. The excitement reached its peak when a high-grade example sold at a major auction house for more than $35,000, igniting a flurry of bidding in subsequent sales. Daniel watched all of this unfold with a quiet sense of pride. He'd held onto his dime through the early rush, and now, as the market matured, he began to seriously consider letting it go. When he finally consigned it to auction, the catalog description dedicated an entire page to the story of its discovery and significance. On the night of the sale, he sat in the back of the room, once again gripping the edge of his chair as the bidding began. Each bid sent a shock through him as the numbers climbed higher and higher, surpassing even his most optimistic expectations. The hammer finally fell on a price squarely in the range of $38,500 to $103,000, depending on condition and demand that season. As he left the auction hall that evening, he couldn't help but smile to himself. All those years spent sifting through rolls for nothing more than the love of the hunt had led him here to this moment. In his pocket, he still carried another roll of dimes waiting to be opened. Because if the 1990 dime had taught him anything, it was that even the most ordinary coins sometimes hide the most extraordinary secrets.